To distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be with all of you here today and to shine a spotlight on a very important knowledge products that we had prepared and we had launched just last year during the COP27 by Her Excellency Mariam Dhaheri, the Minister of Climate Change and Environment. So let me take you through this interesting green business toolkit. I take you back first to 2018, where the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment had published the first edition of the Green UAE Green Business Toolkit, and that had been focused actually on inspiring businesses around the country to take the first steps in becoming more eco-friendly. So the three key areas highlighted in that document had been providing guidance on green office, green procurement, and green products. Since that time, public awareness in sustainability has grown significantly, and in the second edition that we had launched last year, MOCA wanted to call attention to a topic which is of a great importance to the country. And this latest edition of the UAE Green Business Toolkit was developed in collaboration with our partner organization, the Global Green Growth Institute, which we highly appreciate their role in supporting UAE and supporting the Ministry of Climate Change work and several works and strategies. So thank you very much, GGGI team. I really appreciate that. So let's take you through the toolkit itself. So before that, we were proud actually to, in 2021, to became the first country in the MENA region to adopt or to be net zero by 2050. And the 2050 or the Net Zero by 2050 strategic initiative includes and builds on the country's 3 decades of robust climate action and represents a national strategic target for the next 3 decades. And in the words of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, he say, we are committed to seize the opportunity to cement our leadership on climate change within our region and take this key economic opportunity to drive development, growth, and the new jobs as we pivot our economy and nation to net zero, with an investment of over 600 billion dirham in renewable energy. So our vision for a clean future is clear. So with this ambitious target, the entire business sector had really a very crucial role to play in this regard, and to make sure in delivering the greenhouse gases emission reduction targets. But for many business leaders, the concept of net zero, including the necessary steps for achieving such a target, may still not be clear. So the objective of this second edition of the toolkit was to galvanize the UAE businesses to prioritize the net zero planning by providing them with detailed guidance on the steps that they should be undertaken in alignment with the latest climate science. Through this toolkit, business professionals have access to the necessary tools and know-how to plan and deliver on their respective net zero roadmaps. So, as part of the strategic vision of achieving net zero emissions by 2050, UAE had already identified 4 sectors to champion 11 integrated programs with the dedicated support of key ministries. So the industry sector will be championed by the Ministry of Industry and Advanced Technology. The environment sector will be championed by the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, and the energy sector will be championed by the Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure. And finally, the transport sector also will be championed by the Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure. So, what is net zero and why does it matter? So to prepare the business professionals to contribute effectively to the UAE national target, we need first to be clear what exactly net zero means and why it is such an important goal for our country. So the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, had concluded that we need to keep global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degree, and in order to meet this goal, net zero greenhouse gas emissions will need to be achieved by 2050. So net zero does not mean that we eliminate the greenhouse gases emissions completely, but instead there is commitment to reduce all avoidable emissions, and any residual emissions will then be removed from the atmosphere or offset through nature-based solution or technology solutions. So that means that the more emissions which are initially reduced, the fewer offsets will be needed. So what does it mean for business in UAE? We also need to be clear what this target would mean for the local businesses sector. And to achieve this national target, businesses of all sizes and across all industries will need to contribute to the energy transition, but rather than a challenge, it should be seen as an opportunity that needs to be taken. And we need to emphasize that transitioning to a net zero economy will not put industry or jobs at risk. So instead, committing to a net zero strategy will actually bring about commercial benefits for businesses, including enhancing their reputation amongst customers, driving innovation, which will expand their service offerings and building the resilience of business model against future changes in regulation related to greenhouse gases emissions and sustainability-related customer preferences. So at this, I would like to conclude, and I would like to hand over to my colleague Winnie from the Global Green Growth Institute to take us through the roadmap that had been already developed in that toolkit and to give us more insights about it. So Winnie?
Thank you, Engineer Aysha, and thank you for everyone for joining us this afternoon. As Engineer Aysha has mentioned, committing to a net zero target should really be seen as a business opportunity rather than just a challenge that's incredibly daunting. But especially for small and medium-sized businesses, it can be a big challenge in the sense that they may feel that they don't have the adequate resources to commit to net zero planning. But there are definitely accessible pathways for businesses of all sizes and certainly across all different types of industries as well. And the toolkit is intended to provide guidance to help businesses get started. Because I think there are a lot of progressive and sustainability-focused business leaders, but they're just not really sure where to even start. It should be noted that there's not really one single type of net zero strategy that would be applicable to all types of companies, because the timeline and the specific courses of action that will be taken by various businesses will really much depend on the characteristics of the company, including the size, including the sector, as well as their strategic focus. But in the toolkit, we have provided 4 concrete steps, which we think should be commonly followed by businesses when they're undertaking the development of a net zero strategy and roadmap. And these recommendations are in alignment with the best practices outlined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, as well as the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And they're both the standard setters within the marketplace when it comes to decarbonization. Just to kind of go through some of the steps. The first step certainly is to measure the amount of greenhouse gas emissions by a business. And that's a critical first step because that establishes the baseline against which you're trying to measure your emissions reductions by establishing your existing carbon footprint. And at the same time, aside from that, it also provides you with a sense of where would be the sources of the greatest amount of reductions going forward. Looking at the schematic, we can see that a business's total carbon footprint is comprised of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. When we're referring to scope 1 and 2, those are the business's organizational carbon footprint. And so the scope 1 is the direct emissions related to sources owned or controlled by the business. And a good example of that would be fuel consumption, whereas scope 2 emissions would be categorized as indirect emissions, and that's coming from purchase energy. And some examples of that would include electricity, would include cooling, heat, or steam. Now, the source data for these types of, for these two scopes, they should generally be available through your finance department or through your procurement. And it's just a little bit more tricky now when we're looking at the scope 3. When we refer to the scope 3, that's emissions across the water value chain, and that's both going in the upstream to the supply chain as well as the downstream when we're looking at the life cycle of the products and services that are being offered by businesses. Now, given the complexity of trying to get accurate data and reliable data from within your value chain, sorry, last day of COP, it will leave, there's generally a little bit more flexibility when it comes to scope 3 reporting, but it's a little bit misleading if we're really primarily focused on scope 1 and 2, only because the majority of the emissions will be coming from scope 3, and so it would be remiss if we weren't looking at that as well. And on top of that, it will also be the source of the greatest amount of reductions when we're looking at a company's carbon footprint. The next step we should be looking at in a company's net zero journey, is that once the baseline has been determined, it's to establish the net zero targets for the company, for both in the near term as well as in the long term. Net zero targets, as we've mentioned earlier, should be science-based, and as Engineer Aysha has mentioned earlier, we should be in alignment with the Paris Agreement, which at the moment, the current target is 1.5 degrees Celsius. A comprehensive net zero target would also look at all sorts of greenhouse gas emissions, and so not only at the CO2, just because, again, we want to be comprehensive. As mentioned, given the difficulty of measuring scope 3 emissions, yeah, thank you. Given the difficulty of measuring even scope 3 emissions to begin with, there's also greater flexibility when it comes to reductions for scope 3. So at the outset, in the near term, and by the near term, we're referring to the first 5 to 10 years after a net zero target has been set, then at least 95% of scopes 1 and 3 should be targeted to be reduced during that time frame. But in the long term, we are looking for the same level of emissions reductions across all 3 scopes. In the third step, after a business has formalized its baseline and then also established its net zero targets, then it's really time for delivery. And an emissions reduction roadmap will need to be produced by the respective businesses. The priority for a net zero strategy should certainly be first to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions on an absolute basis, because that is more within their control, and certainly as much as technically feasible. As Engineer Aysha has mentioned, there will be hard-to-abate sectors and there will be hard-to-abate activities, but we really are looking at the maximum amount of reductions on an absolute basis to start. And as we also mentioned earlier in the presentation, there really isn't a one-size-fits-all strategy when it comes to development of a net zero roadmap. And the different courses of actions that a business decides to undertake in order to reduce their carbon emissions will really depend on this. Will really be sector-specific and depend on the characteristics of that particular business, as well as certainly the complexity of their supply chains, because as we've mentioned, that's relatively more difficult to control. For any business, regardless of size or industry, a good place to start would be what we would call the low-hanging fruit. And you can see from the screen a number of activities which we've highlighted, which all companies should just kind of take a look at within their corporate profile and see what are some of the action items that can just be operationalized relatively quickly, as well as in a very cost-efficient manner. Some of these suggestions that we've include adopting energy efficiency policies, switching to cleaner sources of energy. We're also looking at greening the fleet within a company, and that includes reducing the use of internal combustion engines, and also reducing air business travel as much as possible. And then lastly, in the last step that we presented within the toolkit, it's really important to communicate any achievements that have been made by individual businesses. And we really encourage business leaders to spread the word on some of the milestones that they've been able to achieve in order to raise awareness for the importance of net zero. I think one thing that's really helpful is, especially when you're a business that's starting out in the journey and they don't feel that they're up to the task, when they see there are businesses of similar sizes or shapes doing really good work, then they're also encouraged to do the same, and they may be able to have the confidence to undertake this journey. Some actions which we encourage our business leaders to do include publishing their net zero targets at the outset, firstly for their own accountability, but also, again, just to give others confidence that they could do the same. We also encourage companies to be disclosing their progress on an interim basis, again, firstly from an accountability standpoint, but just to give the confidence for others within the marketplace that this is achievable. And then when we're talking about scope 3 as well, I think aside from looking at the reductions in emissions of your own carbon footprint, we're also looking at stakeholders to communicate to both their upstream and downstream stakeholders along their value chain in order to encourage them to similarly prioritize net zero planning. One initiative which has been launched successfully by MOCA is the UAE Climate Responsible Companies Pledge, and this is just another example of the great work that the ministry is doing in terms of promoting collective climate action. Signatories to this pledge, they commit to adopting measures to intensify their efforts to combat climate change, and that would include the development and publication of science-based decarbonization action plans. And so that concludes the presentation for the Green Business Toolkit, but I think we have a little bit of time for any further questions, either on net zero more broadly, this token specific, or anything else that you may have related to this broader topic, so thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering how many company in UAE are concerned by doing the carbon footprint and in a term of a private company. So do you know how the amount of the company?
Yeah, we don't have precise statistics on this, but I think just even given the engagement that we have had within the private sector, certainly within the development of this toolkit, in events like this as yourself, including events like this one, as well within the pledge that I referenced that's been launched by MOCA, we are seeing quite a bit of attention being placed on to sustainability more broadly, but also to net zero. As we've mentioned, that is a very important strategic initiative for the country, and I think we're seeing demand from all different sources within the company level itself, stakeholders, from customers, but also within employees, because I think people are much more strategic about where they want to work, and they want to be working for a company that they're proud of and that is committed to sustainability and net zero in specific. So yeah, we are definitely seeing a much more of a demand for net zero.
Hello, congratulations again on the wonderful work. We spoke earlier today about climate finance. We have the business toolkit here. I'm trying to make some sense in the larger strategy of net zero. It still seems it's fairly consultative. The ecosystem's coming together. We're getting the initial strokes of what that climate finance value chain might look like. I want to know, given the targets that we have for net zero, at what point do we see these targets being enforced? To what extent has that happened so far? And how does that look like from the standpoint of the major industries within the UAE, but also from startups who are trying to be sustainable with the bare minimum they have?
Sure. I think one of the objectives of this toolkit was just to really indicate that net zero is applicable to businesses of all shapes and sizes. Certainly, a large conglomerate which may have spent a considerable amount of time planning their net zero trajectories, they would find that this toolkit is already information that they have read up on and are very familiar with. But at the same time, there are always, areas for improvement as well as further areas of engagement. In terms of tracking, one of the initiatives that's been launched by MOCA and which was also just announced during COP this year is the National MRV. And so that will be a very important tool to be able to track the progress of the UAE when it comes to decarbonization. That's already been taking place at the federal level, and we're also seeing the launch of a similar program within Abu Dhabi, and I imagine that other Emirates will come online as well. I'm trying to think what other components of your question I've missed. The connection with climate finance. So again, I think we are seeing a significant imbalance between the amount of funds that have been allocated towards mitigation versus adaptation. And so, of course, we're very excited by any activity that is geared towards mitigation, and that's what we're referring to when we're talking about net zero. And so we can see that actually the sources of funding when it comes to mitigation finance isn't just the large development banks. It isn't just the large bilateral institutions. It's actually coming from the SMEs as well, because they also have their role to play. And I think that's a critical thing that needs to be underlined with this exercise, certainly within this toolkit, but just more broadly, the strategic initiative that's being led by the UAE. It's everybody's role to play. It's not just the big institutional investors that should really be looking at climate finance. And then one thing that we do need to consider when we're talking about tracking, aside from GHG, is also even just tracking these investments. Because these tiny investments that maybe SMEs are making towards decarbonization, perhaps that should be calculated as well, because that's all going towards the volumes, towards climate action. Yeah, I think we're doing really well on time, so thank you very much.